Welcome. My name is James Jordan. I'm from the Stanford Alumni Association, and we are glad that you have joined us for our new series called The Night Before. And this time, the night before the 100th birthday of Malcolm X. The series is open to Stanford alumni and your friends, and our aim is to create enriching experiences that give our community an occasion to come together and invite reflection on some of the ritual events in our shared culture. Earlier this year, we celebrated Halloween, Valentine's Day, International Jazz Day, but tonight it's about Malcolm X, who will remain a central figure in U.S. history of the 1950s and 60s. The Night Before is brought to you by the Stanford Humanities Center, the leading university-based research center for the humanities. So for a few words to introduce the series, here is Roland Green, the director of the Humanities Center and a professor of English and Comparative Literature.
Thank you, James. It's great to be with you all. The heart of the Night Before series is a guided conversation prompted by a Stanford scholar who is often a faculty member or sometimes a fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center. We have about 50 fellows with us every year. They're at all levels, from external faculty at a very senior level all the way down to undergraduates working on a senior thesis. And they have many differences among them in fields, in generations and approaches, but what they all have in common is what we're going to try to achieve tonight. They make sense of culture. So it's a pleasure to share perspectives with you and to enable you to share yours with each other. If you enjoy this event, I invite you to follow not only this series, but our many other events. They are all free and open to the public, and nearly all of them are hybrid, so you may join us either in person or online. Go to shc.stanford. You may sign up for our newsletter to ensure you don't miss anything. We hope to see you again. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Roland. So we typically recommend a cocktail for each Night Before event, something keeping with the occasion. But as we will hear, we're making an exception tonight. Let me introduce Derek, our Night Before mixologist. Derek?
Hello, everybody. So somehow I have become the Night Before mixologist, and this is a gig that I approach with a lot of humility, not being a scholar, and this evening with extra humility, because Malcolm X didn't drink alcohol. That was partly because he was Muslim, but also, as he told Black folks, you are more dangerous sober than you are drunk, meaning more dangerous to the status quo. And you can find a clip of that video on the website for this program. So for both of those reasons, spiritual and political, proposed an evening of sobriety tonight. But the man who became Malcolm X did drink in his earlier life, and he used a lot of other substances as part of his life as a hustler in Harlem. The fact that he changed in his capacity to transform himself as a result of experience and reflection, that's something I have admired from my limited exposure to Malcolm X. So you might think of his sobriety as a reflection of that capacity for change. For what it's worth, if you did want a cocktail that could acknowledge Malcolm X's earlier identity, it happens that my favorite cocktail of all, and I'm not trying to be silly, is what's known as a Black Manhattan. This is a real cocktail, and basically you take a Manhattan, which is whiskey and vermouth, and instead of vermouth, you substitute Amaro, which is a whole class of aperitifs. This is a one that you'll see around a lot, Averna. Amaro is Italian for bitter. Again, not trying to be silly, but that could be an option for thinking about the man who became Malcolm X. As I try to think about what non-alcoholic beverages might be associated with Malcolm X, he was from Michigan, which is why he was known briefly as Detroit Red, and I think that would be a terrific name for a drink. That led me to the fact that red drink in Black American culture, as many of you know, can refer to anything from Kool-Aid to a whole variety of punches made usually with hibiscus, which are part of a lot of African cuisines to this day. Red drink is sometimes described as the unofficial beverage of Juneteenth. However, this is not my cultural territory, so rather than attempting a recipe, I mentioned that just as something you can explore further if you're not already familiar. Tonight for myself, I decided to just drink some ice water and leave you with a tip about using ice in drinks, which is just that if you, whether or not there's alcohol involved, if you take your ice out of the freezer and let it rest in your glass for a few minutes before you pour anything over it, that should prevent it from popping and cracking and diluting your drink, if that's important. And you're not supposed to make a toast with water, but I think if we're celebrating Malcolm X tonight, perhaps it's okay if we raise a glass, and not to be presumptuous, but perhaps it's appropriate to say assalamu alaikum, peace be with you, as part of our toast. I leave that to the experts.
Now, thank you, Derek. We will be returning to have an official cocktail or mocktail at our next night before event. But we had some good suggestions for this evening, and I have mine here in my my water here in my mug right here. Looking forward to the conversation tonight. Um, Whatever you have at hand, please feel free in joining us to toasting the exchange of ideas presented by the humanities, and especially at the Stanford Humanities Center. So here. So now I'd like to introduce Lerone Martin, our guide for the next few minutes, who will speak about Malcolm X's significance and legacy. Professor Martin is the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor, Professor of Religious Studies, and Director of the King Research and Education Institute at Stanford. He is also an award-winning author. His most recent book, The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, How the FBI Aided and Abetted the Rise of White Christian Nationalism, was published in February 2023 and has garnered praise from numerous publications. So I'm going to toss it to Lerone, but before I do, I want to remind you, if you have some questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat. We will allow some time for Q&A. And we'll also be using the, you can raise your hand function as well as part of Zoom. You have a question and I'll call on you during that time. But for now, I'd love to toss it over to Lerone. Thank you for doing this for us.
Thank you, James. It's great to be with you all. And I want to say hello to all of those who are joining us online remotely. It is my honor and pleasure as the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor and Director of the King Institute here at Stanford to virtually welcome you to our brand new space. We are officially on the quad in Building 370. I am in our exhibit hall. You can see some of our exhibit behind us. And I can't wait for all of the alums and your friends to come to campus to welcome you into our new space in Building 370. We'll have an open house in the fall where we will officially cut the ribbon. And so I can't wait to see all of you then and to give you a tour into a new space that is absolutely beautiful. But tonight, as we are focused on Malcolm X and not Martin Luther King Jr., I'm excited to talk to you for a little bit about why we loved Malcolm. Malcolm X, it seems to me, as a scholar of African-American history, we loved him and we appreciate him for three major reasons. The first is that we loved Malcolm because he taught us self-appreciation. This is something that Malcolm was introduced to, the importance of it, when he was in the womb. Malcolm, as many of you know, was born in Omaha. Tomorrow will mark 100 years since he's been born. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925. And while he was still in the womb, as our very own alum, Dr. Tubbs, teaches us in her book, The Three Mothers, while Malcolm was in his mother's womb, his family was attacked by a local white supremacist group known as the Klan. And they threatened his family and threatened to destroy the family's home and their property because they were living in a white neighborhood. And so the family fled, but because of threats against their life and against their livelihood and their property, they fled and moved to Milwaukee first and stayed in Milwaukee for a while and eventually landed in Lansing, Michigan, where 2-year-old Malcolm, still in diapers and eating from his bottle, moved into Lansing, Michigan. And there the family was once again attacked by white supremacists because the family had bought a home and property that had a restrictive covenant to it, a covenant that says it could not be sold to African Americans. So as Malcolm's father, Earl Little, was going from job to job to job because of racism, and as an experienced contractor could not find a job because he was discriminated against, the family once again was attacked. Their home was burned down to the ground, and they lost all of their belongings and all of their possessions. So Malcolm knew early on about what it meant to be African American in this country, and how the color of his skin, the fact that his family had been kissed by the sun, was somehow supposed to be a curse to the family. And so from there, the family moved around in Lansing, Michigan, trying to find work. And then Malcolm's father is murdered. Now, Malcolm had always believed that his father was killed by white supremacists, run over by a streetcar. Some of the other family members believed it was an accident, but one understands why Malcolm would believe his father was murdered, given that his entire life up to that point, he had been stalked and haunted by white supremacists simply because of the color of their skin. But Malcolm's mother soldiered on. Malcolm's mother was a corresponding secretary for the UNIA, the United Negro Improvement Association. And she taught the children, even at an early age, about what it meant to be African American, that it was not something, to be Black was not something to be ashamed of, but something to be proud of. And so Malcolm carried that with him. He went on to be president of his 7th grade class there in Michigan, there in an integrated school with Black and white, and Malcolm was rising up to his potential. But then a teacher of his asked Malcolm in 7th grade, "What do you want to be when you grow up, Malcolm? What do you want to be?" And Malcolm recounts in his autobiography that he said to his white teacher, as president of the 7th grade class with some of the highest grades in the class, Malcolm said, "I want to be a lawyer." And his white teacher said to him, "Come on now, Malcolm, you ought to be realistic. You ought to consider being a carpenter. No one's ever heard of a nigger lawyer before." So even at the tender age of 7th grade, Malcolm is being told that his race is supposed to put a cap on his potential. What he can possibly be in life is always going to be circumscribed by the fact that he's Black. And so from there, with no father in the home and his mother trying to care for Malcolm and his 6 siblings, Malcolm's family deteriorates. And then they are separated by the court system there in Michigan, and they are sent to live in various different homes. And Malcolm goes into a group home. And there, Malcolm slowly begins to engage in what he calls a rebellion and engage to start to hate white people. And so Malcolm leaves Michigan as a young, tall, 6'4" teenager and moves to Boston, where he lives with his half-sister Ella. And there, Malcolm goes from job to job to job. And finally, in 1944, he finds a job selling suits. And this is where he actually possibly met Martin Luther King Jr. for the first time. Most of us think of this photo here as the first time they met, but Malcolm actually was traveling for a suit tailor in 1944, traveling through the Northeast, and he lands upon a farm where young African-American students from HBCUs across the South are working in the tobacco farms. And Martin Luther King Jr. is actually there. And so there are several men who remember buying suits from Malcolm that he jumped off of a truck and unfolded his 6'4" legs with a conch in his hair that was slicked back, and actually was selling suits and telling all of these young men all they needed was a suit. Now, we don't know if Martin and Malcolm actually met that summer in 1944, but we know they were in the same space. And we also know from there that their lives went in 2 different directions. While King started to figure out a life where he could change the world, Malcolm's world became more circumscribed, and he became someone who was induced into drug use, into a haze of robbing and stealing all across the Northeast, becoming known as Detroit Red in many places, working in Harlem, working with another gentleman named St. Louis Red, who was Red Fox, the comedian. And Malcolm goes all around working everywhere, robbing and stealing. So he finally lands himself in prison in 1946. And there, Malcolm begins to rehash all the lessons his mother taught him as a young man about what it means to be Black and to be proud and what it means to be sober-minded, and to work to change the status quo. And this is where he's introduced by one of his brothers into the Nation of Islam. And from there, in the Nation of Islam, Malcolm serves 6.5 years in prison. He educates himself. He reads books. He participates in the debate team. And he becomes, from Malcolm Little into the man we know as Malcolm X. And there, Malcolm begins to build up the Nation of Islam. He first becomes minister in Boston, where he once ran the streets, and he goes into all the nightclubs and the bars and the pool halls and starts recruiting men that he used to do dirt with. And now Malcolm recruits them to join the nation. And Malcolm starts preaching self-appreciation, something that he had been taught all along from his mother's womb up until now. He begins to teach the nation about what it means to be Black. He starts to give sermons and speeches on street corners across Harlem as the national spokesman of the Nation of Islam, and starts to tell people, and particularly African Americans, who told you your nose was too big? Who told you your skin was too dark? Who told you your hair was too nappy? Who told you that you're not beautiful? It's because of this message from Malcolm about self-appreciation, living in a country that said that Black was something to be ashamed of. Malcolm began preaching and became in a long tradition of African-American prophets who flipped the script and told Black people that it's something to be proud of to be Black. Malcolm would say, our skin shines like gold, right? He would say that. And he often taught about what it means to be Black in a country that told children from the womb that being Black was something to be ashamed of. And Malcolm goes on to inspire countless activists, and particularly from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to inspire them about what it means to be Black. And the whole entire Black is beautiful and Black cultural nationalism, from afros and natural, wearing your hair natural, and certain types of clothes and names, all of that in many ways, Malcolm contributed to all of that because of the way that he taught us about self-appreciation. Now, next to that, of course, self-appreciation is the second reason why we loved him, and that was because he taught us about self-determination. Being part of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm believed that self-determination was key to African Americans becoming free and equal in this country. He believed simply that African Americans should have a role in determining what happens in their communities. Now, this is something that may sound simple now, but it was profound in the time that Malcolm lived, when African Americans were barred from voting all across the country, not just in the South, but across this country. Malcolm started teaching that African Americans should have control of the schools in their communities. They should have control of the cultural institutions and the economics in their communities. This was an important lesson to be taught at the time. Now, this should not be confused with segregation, right? This is something very different, because segregation is something that is imposed upon a group of people from the outside, right? But Malcolm would say that separation that he began to preach with the Nation of Islam is something that African Americans would do by choice, and that they would have control of the mechanisms in their community. Whereas segregation, everything was always still controlled by the white dominant forces in their communities. But Malcolm preached something different. And he began to preach this across the country and across the Nation of Islam, that if America was not going to treat its citizens of color equally, then the citizens of color should be completely separate. And because of this self-determination, we loved Malcolm. He taught us of what it meant that African Americans actually could control their own communities, and African Americans actually had the capacity to rule their communities and had the capacity to thrive and flourish. This was something that was a phenomenal message. It was a message that was radical in the 1950s America. And finally, we loved Malcolm because of the way that he taught us self-rumination. As my dear brother Derek shared earlier, Malcolm has this capacity that we love for change, that he always was meditating and thinking about his positions. He always remained open-minded to the point where he was willing to change, and open-minded enough to do something that is rarely done in public life today, and that is to admit that one was wrong. And Malcolm did this in a number of ways. Malcolm begins to really see that there may be an error in his way. In 1962, when because of the message he was preaching, the FBI began to tail him. And so Malcolm actually has a meeting in 1962 with the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia. And because of the FBI tailing him, the FBI has an informant in this meeting. Now, Malcolm has been told by Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, to go to Georgia and to actually negotiate with the Klan to figure out if there's a way that the Klan can help the Nation of Islam get its own territory, perhaps in the South. And so Malcolm is very upset about this. He wants to go down and wants to have a verbal debate with this white supremacist organization, but he's under strict direction not to do so. So Malcolm goes and he's having this debate, and we know this because of the FBI, and he says to the Klan, and he's joking with them, and he's so brilliant and intelligent because of being on the debate team. He says to the Klan, well, if we're going to work together, the Nation of Islam, we want robes. And the FBI says that the Klansman begins to shake and stir, say, no, 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 white robes are only for Klansmen. And Malcolm says, well, how are we going to work together if we don't have any robes? And they're going back and forth and going back and forth. And finally, the Klan reveals what they're really concerned about. The Klan says, look, we'll talk about that later. And this is where Malcolm begins to realize that maybe something needs to be altered and to think again in his mind. The Klan says, we'll talk about all that later. We want you to help us to get to Martin Luther King Jr. And so here's Malcolm X talking to the Klan. And the Klan is more concerned about Martin Luther King Jr. than they are about Malcolm. And so Malcolm begins to think that maybe there's something to be said here. Why is the Klan so concerned about the nonviolent king, but not so concerned about this group known as the Nation of Islam? And so Malcolm begins to rethink some of his positions. He starts to rethink the Nation of Islam and its commitment at the time to being apolitical, to not voting. Malcolm starts to think that maybe there's something that African Americans should start participating in voting. African Americans should start politically organizing. Malcolm starts to rethink a number of things, including the sort of biological determinism of racism. Malcolm eventually goes on a Hajj and goes to Mecca and goes to the Middle East, and he meets Muslims who have white skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair. This, Malcolm has always been told his entire life in the Nation of Islam that racism is biologically determined, that white people are born racist. But then when he meets white people in Mecca, in the Middle East, and engaging in the Hajj, he realizes that there's something wrong with that belief. And he recognizes that racism is something that we call today a social construct, something that is put into our society, something that people are socialized to believe, that one race is better than the other. No one is born racist. This is something people are taught, both explicitly and implicitly. So Malcolm rethinks his position both on Martin Luther King Jr., on politics, and also on white brothers and sisters. He's suspended from the Nation of Islam because he makes a comment about JFK. He is suspended, and for the remainder of his life, 1964 and 1965, he begins to make a number of changes. And one of the changes that he does not get enough credit for is Malcolm begins to change also the way he thinks about women. Now, Malcolm will always be praised. Everyone from Beyonce and others have praised Malcolm because of the way that he talks about African-American women needing protection. He says the African-American woman is the most unprotected creature on the planet. And because of that, we have always loved Malcolm for that. But there was an underside to that protection. As Farrah Jasmine Griffith teaches us in her essay, Ironies of the Saints, Farrah taught us that unfortunately for Malcolm and so many other men like him, protection came with a price, and that was possession. That for men to protect women also means that men possess them, that women become possessions of men. Malcolm, after his Hajj, writes to his brother, and he confesses this. He says that I taught men to spit acid at women. I taught men to treat women as unequal. I taught men to treat women badly. I did that, and now I must undo that. So Malcolm always had this commitment to change, the self-rumination, to always opening up his mind that maybe the truth he thought he found, maybe perhaps he was wrong. And so we loved him for this. We loved him because he taught us self-appreciation in the African American community. We loved him because he taught us the importance of self-determination in the African American experience. And we loved him because he taught us how to self-ruminate, how to always be rethinking our positions and always to be open to change and always be willing to admit when one is wrong, not as a sign of weakness, but as a sign of strength. And we loved Malcolm because he loved us enough to teach us all these lessons. And so on the eve before his 100th birthday, we honor Malcolm today on this event as someone who taught us so much and someone who is often misunderstood because of his evolution. And we can only imagine with our imagination, we can only think what Malcolm would have become had he lived past 1965. So on today, we wrestle with Malcolm's ideals, we converse with him as a conversation partner, and we thank him for all that he taught us. So I look forward to a chance to talk with all of you in a time of Q&A. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Lerone. This was great. Thank you so much. This is a time for questions. If you feel free to raise your hand and use the raise your hand function, you can come off mute and you can ask your question directly. Or if you'd like to put it in our chat, we will take it from there or come off mute and ask the question directly. Feel free to do that as well. Who wants to start?
All right, I got one.
All right.
If I may. Professor Martin, you talked about the way that Malcolm X changed his mind. I'm curious about changes in the way that he was perceived by other people. I mean, he had a lot of friction with people, with different parts of the movement, and obviously with white politicians. But during his lifetime and after his lifetime, what's been the arc of the way he's been received?
Thank you for that question, Derek. I think that Malcolm is still to this day, I teach to this day, Malcolm is still perceived as someone who's angry and violent. I teach a class here on campus between Martin and Malcolm, but I also teach a class through Stanford Digital Education for high school students. So this year we have 165 high school students from Title I high schools. And when the students come into the class, they all still have this idea that, yeah, I'm with Malcolm, he's the tough one, right? And King is the softy. And some of that comes from the fact that some of the images we have of Malcolm in the later part of his life, when his life is under threat from the Nation of Islam, Malcolm is often pictured with a gun. He did a photo shoot for Life magazine where he's looking out the window with a large assault rifle. And that has lingered long in the American memories. And also his rhetoric around believing in biological determinism of racism, or that white people are blue-eyed devils, right? We often hear those parts of Malcolm, and that contributes to us looking at him as this angry, violent man. But from the record, from what we know, Malcolm was anything but that. He tried boxing as a young man. He was terrible. He talks about this in his autobiography. He was knocked out twice. We know from his life, he never shot anyone while he was hustling in the streets of New York. I think there were some fights, but no one was ever murdered. And so Malcolm comes full circle in many ways. And so the end of his life, while Malcolm still believes in self-defense, he believes it's important for African Americans to defend themselves. He never advocated seriously outright guerrilla warfare and going out and just hurting people. But he did always advocate for self-defense. Now, people often juxtapose that to Martin Luther King Jr., who advocated nonviolence throughout his life to try to demonize Malcolm. So I think Malcolm's perception, even to this day, is that he's not given credit for some of the evolution of which you yourself spoke about. he's not given credit for that in the way that he should receive credit for changing the way he thinks about women, changing the way he thinks about the role of white brothers and sisters, changing the role that he thinks of using self-defense and weapons. I don't think Malcolm gets enough credit for that. Unfortunately, Malcolm is often frozen in a convenient spot of being the evil villain. And so I often like to tell my students that Malcolm is vilified and King is sort of anesthetized, right? And in reality, to get us closer to who these men were, we have to make sure we don't vilify Malcolm and we don't make King too much of a pushover, right? As someone who's passive, because King is anything but that. So I think that that's kind of the way that they're often thought about and juxtaposed against one another.
Thank you. Cheryl, I see your hand. Why don't you ask your question?
Yeah, in the beginning, when you were talking about his infancy and before he was born, the violence visited upon his family, was that more than other African Americans experienced? And if so, was it because the family was actually coming up in the world?
That's a great question. And you're absolutely right. His father, Earl Little, was a preacher and a member of the United Negro Improvement Association and was constantly challenging racial norms. As I said, he bought property in Omaha and in Michigan that were considered in white neighborhoods. They were protected by restrictive covenants, which, at that time were still deemed illegal by the Supreme Court in this country. Restrictive housing covenants were not overturned in this country until 1947, and they were never overturned. They were simply just ruled unenforceable. So Malcolm's father, always pushing against the status quo, did expose his family to a higher level of violence, from seeing lynchings in Omaha, Nebraska, to their house being firebombed in Michigan, and the way that the courts tore apart his family. There are a number of ways in which, yes, Malcolm, because of his father and his mother's activism, he was exposed to an increased amount of violence. That white supremacy was violent by nature, but Malcolm experienced a level of intensity because of his parents' activism.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, we have a question in the chat from Samdul. Do you want to ask it, or would you like me to read it? I can go ahead and read it. Thank you for your wonderful talk. Can you talk about how Malcolm was largely responsible for changing the Nation of Islam to becoming less separatist? I'm not sure that's the right word, but that's the question in the chat.
I think Malcolm's he's suspended and eventually leaves the Nation of Islam, as many of you know about his story. But I think his activism and the way that he was able to be involved in national politics, I think it did inspire later leaders, including Louis Farrakhan, and getting involved in politics. And so I do think that Malcolm's example did begin to move the nation. At one point in time, Elijah Muhammad's son became the leader of the Nation of Islam and tried to steer the Nation of Islam more closely to Sunni Islam. Eventually, that did not work. Wallace Muhammad, that did not work. Louis Farrakhan took over and still remains the head of the Nation of Islam. And but as a result, it's following more along the lines, and Malcolm in some ways, and being politically active. Everything from several years ago, they led the Million Man March on Washington, D.C., and so forth and so on. So I do think Malcolm's example led other people, including Louis Farrakhan, who knew Malcolm, into a direction to be more politically engaged.
Thanks. Okay, Itamar has a question. Did Malcolm ever talk about a state with an African-American majority?
When Malcolm was with the Nation of Islam, yes, they advocated to say that if America will not use its laws to protect African Americans' life or property, that the United States should give African Americans their own separate land. The Nation of Islam would talk about having several states in the South would be dedicated just for African Americans, and they requested that the federal government would support that until that separate country was able to support itself. Once Malcolm goes on the Hajj and leaves the Nation of Islam, he no longer embraces that ideal. While he still embraces the ideal that African Americans should have self-determination in their own communities, he no longer embraces the ideal of a whole entire separate nation, separate states in the southern states that he once did when he was with the Nation of Islam.
Right. Just a reminder, feel free to raise your hand. We have another question in the chat. You can also put it in the chat and I'll read it and pose it to Dr. Martin. The next is from Sophia. Thank you for the talk, Dr. Martin. I'm curious what his agenda was for meeting up with the Ku Klux Klan, and if this meeting was the primary reason for his reconsideration of his membership in the Nation of Islam.
Well, originally, then it's a great question, Sophia. Originally, the meeting was set up as a way because the Klan, like they had done in the 20s with Marcus Garvey, had said, listen, you are claiming you don't want to be here. We don't want you here. So let's meet together and figure out if we can do something about this. And so Elijah Muhammad sent Malcolm to meet with the Klan in Georgia as a way to see if there's a way the two groups could help one another. The Klan saying, we don't want African Americans here. The Nation of Islam was saying, we would like to leave and have our own nation. And so Malcolm was sent there by Elijah Muhammad to set up a meeting to see if there was a way that the two groups could work together. That is one of the points where Malcolm doesn't speak about this meeting, but that is one of the points that several scholars have pointed to, most recently Les Payne in his amazing biography of Malcolm X that's called The Dead Are Rising. It won the Pulitzer Prize. He points out that that's one of the beginning of moments where Malcolm begins to really rethink about the strategy of the Nation of Islam. Another moment is when a gentleman around the same time in the early 1960s, a man by the name of Ronald Stokes, who was a Muslim in Los Angeles, is murdered by the police in Los Angeles. There are unarmed men and several Muslims are injured, and Ronald Stokes is murdered. Malcolm wants to figure out a way to organize and figure out a way to respond to this moment of police brutality. And Elijah Muhammad tells him, no, do not do anything, that God will repay those who did this crime. And so that's another moment where Malcolm finds himself frustrated by saying, we have this amazing organization named the Nation of Islam. We've got chapters across the city. We are set up to organize politically to do something. In many ways, it's like the kind of work he saw his mother and father doing. But because of those moments in the early 60s are moments where Malcolm begins to rethink his commitment to the Nation of Islam. What many scholars point to, and what Malcolm at least will point to in his autobiography, is the fact that when he finds out Elijah Muhammad is reportedly has several children by different women, that Malcolm finally sees that as one of the moments of the last straw of why he begins to think about leaving. But before he can leave, he is suspended suspended from the Nation of Islam for making a comment about the assassination of JFK. He is ordered not to speak about it, to stay out of politics. And when he's asked about JFK's assassination in 1963, he says, quote, that it's a moment of chickens coming home to roost, unquote, saying that America has practiced violence abroad, and now that violence has come back to America. And then he is suspended during that moment, and eventually he leaves the Nation of Islam.
Great. All right, we have a question from Tiffany. Given his tenuous/difficult relationship with the Nation of Islam near the end of his life, what is the nation's relationship to Malcolm X and his legacy today? How is he generally perceived in the nation today?
That is an amazing question. I believe that it's gone through, like Malcolm's life, it's gone through an evolution. Early on in the beginning, Malcolm was vilified in the Nation of Islam, that he was someone that was said that died violently because he was violent, and he had turned his back on Elijah Muhammad. Even Cassius Clay, who would become Muhammad Ali, turns his back on Malcolm X because Malcolm leaves the nation. And of course, Cassius Clay will say, Muhammad Ali, will say later on in life, that was one of his biggest mistakes, that he regrets turning his back on Malcolm. And I think Muhammad Ali, in some ways, is a metaphor for the broader Nation of Islam. But I would say that now their relationship to Malcolm in 2025 is very different than what it was in 1965 when he was murdered. I think that it's evolved in a way that Malcolm is championed for some of the things that he tried to do and the things that he stood for and his cultural impact.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a question. This is my own personal question. Given the landscape that we're facing right now, currently in America, especially the state of affairs with Black Americans, what lessons or can we learn, or how do we feel in the writings that Malcolm has left us? How would he react or respond to the scenarios that we're facing here in the country?
It's a great question. I mean, as a historian, I try to avoid such questions, right? And just say that I only deal with people who are no longer living. But given what Malcolm said while he was alive, I think there are some lessons. I think the first lesson what Malcolm would probably tell us is not to be surprised. I think Malcolm and Martin both would be surprised that we're surprised of where we are today, in the sense of, I think they all would have told us to expect some type of backlash coming off the election of Barack Obama and some of the gains we've made in this country towards expanding the franchise and expanding opportunities to people. I think that both of them would tell us we should not be surprised by that. I think another lesson Malcolm would tell us is also to organize, to figure out a way to organize in our local communities to make sure that we're able to be provide for one another, but also to educate one another. I think Malcolm would be very, very, very concerned about the push against education that we're seeing in this country, about having a true reckoning with our history, right? Malcolm would say that, he said that of all of our studies and of all of our endeavors, history is best suited to reward our research. Because Malcolm understood that in order to understand where you are today and where you're going, you have to understand our history. So I think Malcolm would be very concerned about the way that history is being ripped up and torn up across this country in K through 12 schools. And I think he would tell us that we need to organize, whether they be freedom schools or local community centers, where we could educate children about the true nature of this country, which is not to say that America is damned forever, but it is to say we have to be honest about what America has done. It's the only way that it makes sense about where we find ourselves today. And I think finally, Malcolm would encourage us to maintain a sense of pride, that there are a number of mechanisms that are being used to demonize groups of people. And so I think Malcolm would encourage us, as he did when he was living, to internationalize our concerns. But it's by saying that what's happening in this country is also happening abroad in other countries, where people, based on their identities, are being attacked, are being marginalized, and being arrested. And I think Malcolm would encourage us to always have an international purview about these issues.
Thank you. Wow. All right. Other questions? All right. I have one that just came in. Magdalena. Dr. Martin, since Malcolm X was brutally assassinated, what are your thoughts on how we have, as a nation, have progressed or regressed in terms of advancing Black self-appreciation and self-determination? And do we of other cultures and ethnicities share responsibility to advance social justice?
It's a great question. I think that, Magdalena, I think that we've come up far, far, far away in terms of self-appreciation. I think you'll be hard pressed to find anything within American popular culture today that is not heavily influenced by Black cultural expression. Whether you're talking about hair and makeup, going to a store such as Sephora, right? You'll see someone like Rihanna is dominating in sales there. If you go to think about music on the radio, you'll hear it influenced by African-American cultural expression. Clothing, whether we're talking about the Met Gala or the Cannes Film Festival, we see hair and clothing and dress is all being influenced by African-American life. So I think, at least in that sense, we've gone from African-American cultural expressions to being sort of vilified to increasingly being accepted as sort of mainstream American culture. Now, I think Malcolm would be concerned about what are we doing with that influence, right? Are we simply just making money off of it and forgetting the community, forgetting to reinvest in our communities? I think Malcolm would be concerned about that. But I do think we've made some strides in this country. It's certainly there. But I think Malcolm would always tell us, and King would always tell us as well, that America, tends to have what King would at least call a schizophrenic relationship to racial justice. It's always one or two steps forward and then one or two steps backward. There's never been an abiding commitment. And so I think that there's a way that we could certainly praise some of the advances we have in this society, but Malcolm would tell us to never be satisfied and never took our foot off the gas, because it can always have a backlash and always revert back to where things were. So I think we always have to be vigilant at the wheel to make sure that we're always trying to push the needle towards justice.
Great. All right. Those are the questions that are in the chat currently. Are there any others?
James, may I ask one?
Sure.
So a few minutes ago, Lerone, when James asked you to do what historians don't like to do and entertain a kind of hypothetical question, I'm going to ask an even more hypothetical kind of question. But I'm sure it's something. On the other hand, on the one hand, professionally, I know this is not what a historian does. On the other hand, this must be something you've thought about at some point. Both King and Malcolm were assassinated. I mean, they didn't live to age 40, either of them, right? But it's possible to imagine a different scenario in which, given the years they were born, in which both of them could have lived into the 21st century, if they had not been killed, and if they had, lived to kind of, old age. Can you imagine what that would be like if we had entered the 21st century with both of these figures still alive and in having had a conversation with each other that continued after the 60s and with the people that came after them, like Barack Obama and so on? What would that be like? What could you imagine for that? First of all, you must have thought about King's hypothetical survival at some point, right?
Oh yes. That's an amazing question, especially the conversation part. I've often thought about this, and I think that we have a clue of what it would look like, because it seems as if at the end of their lives, they were coming closer together, and that Martin will say in interviews that he admired Malcolm in many ways. He understood Malcolm's diagnosis of the situation in America. He thought it was sharp and detailed, but they just often disagreed about the solution. And for King, the part of that is always about nonviolence. And I think, but both of them understood the importance of organizing, especially around local communities and politics, and organizing and mobilizing. I think Malcolm, eventually a month before, or not even a month, a couple of weeks before his death, he visits Selma, Alabama, where King is currently in jail. And he goes down and he begins speaking in Selma. And he even says, I think the people in this part of the world need to give Dr. King what he's asking for, because he's asking for it in a very nice way. But there are some of us who are not going to ask so nicely. So I think Malcolm, towards the end of his life, starts realizing that maybe there's value in sort of playing good cop, bad cop with Martin, but towards the same goals, right? Equality, right? Equal opportunity, be able to determine and control what goes on in your community, something we consider to be the American dream. So I think that we could see the two of them coming together, and I could see them going on tour and having conversations with one another and debating and joking with one another. Both of them had great senses of humor, especially King would say, like, I didn't like it when you called me an Uncle Tom, Malcolm. I mean, you could just imagine them having a great time and going on tour together. And I think for Barack Obama, I think I could see King being a thorn in Barack's side as it relates to drone warfare. I could see King saying like, what are you doing here? You know, why are you engaging in drone warfare? I could see that, and I could see Malcolm pressing him as well, thinking around the ideas of making sure equality, especially as it relates to law enforcement and as it relates to economic opportunities for African Americans. And so I think that both of them would have pushed him, and I think it would have been phenomenal to see these two individuals to still be with us. Clarence Jones, who was one of King's attorneys, is still with us today. He's still alive. He's in his 90s. He lives in Palo Alto, and he's one example. He's still up and at 'em. He's speaking. He spoke here at Stanford. He's written a book about his experiences. And so you can imagine also books and articles coming out about their experiences and reminding us at times like this what they did and what lessons we could learn from them. And so it would be like having these amazing sages, these just storehouse of wisdom that would be available to us, and we are all left a big void without having both of them here with us. But thankfully, we have their writings and the books, and we have events like this to always remind us to remain in conversation with them.
Thank you. Right. We have a few more moments, few more minutes if there's any additional questions. I know it's been a lot for us to think about and to ruminate on, but it's been excellent. All right, okay. I see another hand, Magdalena.
Forgive me for not using my video. Thank you very much for hosting this event and for answering all of these questions. Dr. Martin, besides the negative history that we've experienced in this country and still continue to experience, are you hopeful that the lessons that we can learn from Malcolm X and Dr. King will someday get us to the point in our lifetime that we will see more positive change and equity?
You know, because I have the privilege of teaching here at Stanford, I feel like I have no choice but to be hopeful. I have the opportunity to meet young people every day who are committed to lives of justice and equality, are committed to making America to exist closer to what it said on paper, to its founding documents. I have met Stanford alums who are doing that work in the world today. And so I feel like I have no choice but to be hopeful, you know. And as James Baldwin would tell us, you know, we have to be hopeful because we're alive and we have the opportunity and we have the breath to make an impact in our own community. So the answer is yes, I am hopeful. And reading King and reading Malcolm, there are times when you read and you say, Jesus, you know, nothing has changed. But there are also times when you read about their lives and you realize that we have made some efforts and we have made some strides. And it's those words from those individuals, my students, and the work that our alumni do that keeps me hopeful and keeps me afloat and keeps me ready to attack the next day.
Thank you very much. I feel the same. Also, I'm a high school teacher, so I definitely feel that sense of hope with the students that I encounter, that I teach, and that I just pray and think to myself, you know, if they can do it, I will just be so grateful to have been part of having been in their lives to teach them some of the lessons that I could teach. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for the work that you do.
Great. I have one last question that I'll pose or this opportunity. Are there any resources or books or anything that you would recommend if folks want to learn a little more or get to know him? I know he has his autobiography, but any of the scholarly writings or other kind of resources that we should be aware of to learn a little more?
Absolutely. I think as far as books, Les Payne, his book The Dead Are Rising, he worked on it for decades and he passed away before it was done. His daughter finished it, named Tamara Payne. The book is called The Dead Are Rising. It's in a wonderful, wonderful biography of Malcolm. You'll get a chance to see where, as a scholar, Les Payne was able to uncover some things that perhaps Malcolm misremembers in his autobiography. You also get a chance to read some of the real names of some of the people that Malcolm in his book uses pseudonyms for those names. And so I really love that book. If you're looking for something to watch, looking for a program, a documentary to watch, PBS years ago did an amazing documentary called Make It Plain, The Life of Malcolm X, which is an amazing documentary where you get a chance to see his siblings. You get a chance to see some of the people he encountered when he went on his Hajj to the Middle East. You get a chance to see the white New York Times journalists who covered him. And so that documentary is absolutely wonderful. And it might even be available on YouTube. I'm not quite sure about where the outlets the documentary is on, but it's produced by PBS and it's called Make It Plain. I show portions of it to my students all the time, both my college students and my high school students, because it's an amazing documentary. And finally, I think obviously, we're celebrating the Spike Lee film. I think the Spike Lee film is coming up on an anniversary as well. Spike Lee put out the film, which is mostly based on the autobiography. That film is still a classic, which Denzel Washington, who plays Malcolm X, was nominated for an Academy Award for that role. He does a phenomenal job of playing Malcolm X. I think that movie is a classic. But if you're looking for the scholarly approach, I would say both the Les Payne book, The Dead Are Rising, and the PBS special, Make It Plain.
Thank you. I've written those down. Excellent. This looks like someone put in the chat, it is on YouTube. So that's great. Well, we're at time. So it's gone by. Thank you all for joining us. As always, we aim to make this experience memorable for you by bringing the insights of the humanities to shared occasions. So we're planning to bring you more night before events next year. In the meantime, you can find information about other Humanities Center's activities at shc.stanford.edu. As you're logging out of this Zoom, you'll be a survey that will appear. We ask you take a moment to complete those questions. It helps us to make improvements and add new features to the program. And whether we see you again in one of our events next week or next year, we hope that we leave you with a deeper understanding of the legacy of Malcolm X. For now, thanks to Dr. Martin for your time and to all of you for joining us today. Have a great evening and thanks for joining. Good night.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Good night, everyone.